The way this talk came about is that I spoke here 2 years ago at the Game Developers Conference, and I talked about leadership. And as part of that talk, I kind of gave some thoughts about heartfelt communication, but I didn't get very technical about it. And afterwards, that kind of bothered me. Like, I felt like it maybe chickened out a little bit, because I do get very technical about it in my day-to-day work, and I give some very specific advice, but it's kind of a delicate subject, which is why I avoided it. So it's incredibly important, but it can also be difficult to talk about. Here's an example of what might make it difficult. When someone wants to do more at a company, when they want to increase the scope or value of their work, or if you want to be, a little bit vulgar about it, if they just want a promotion, right? Often what stops them is that they get perceptually pigeonholed. You can't actually do senior work if you're in an environment where everyone still treats you like you're junior. And so in those cases, I'll say, if I'm managing this person, part of your work here is to change perceptions, and to do that, I'll get really specific. I'll say, forward me drafts of your emails before you send them out, and I'll write back and say stuff like, your tone in this part is a little conciliatory. I think that sends the wrong message. I'd actually be a tiny bit patronizing here. When I put it in those terms that I'm like giving people calculated advice to be patronizing on purpose, it sounds pretty manipulative. And manipulative, I think, is a dirty word to us, and that's what makes it hard to talk about. Here's another way of putting that. Take two people, who I'm going to call Dale and Eugene. Both of them sent emails with a patronizing tone. Dale is very analytical, and he employs his patronizing tone on purpose to alter the way others see him. Eugene, on the other hand, writes the patronizing email because he's just a patronizing kind of guy. Take a moment to reflect on Dale and Eugene and get a sense for what your gut reaction is to people like each of them. Like, what do you think about their behavior? You probably know people like each of them. But while their outward behavior is the same, in my experience, the general tendency, and maybe you got a sense of this as you were just thinking about it, is we tend to react very negatively to Dale, much more so than Eugene. There's this basic sense that because Dale knows what he's doing, because he's doing this consciously, his behavior is somehow dishonest or even immoral. Both Dale and Eugene's emails are examples of framing, which is the thing I want to talk about, though in Dale's case, the framing is conscious and intentional. If you're talking to someone and they're being condescending towards you, and so you patronize them a little bit in reply to try to combat that, you are reframing the power dynamic of the interaction. A frame, to define it, is just a context. It is a set of basic assumptions. It is a perspective that you bring to and impose upon your interactions with people. There's these two guys, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and they're the founders of an academic field called behavioral economics. And they first used the term framing back in 1981 to describe this phenomenon. In their studies of human decision-making, they noted that phrasing the same choice in different ways can drastically alter the way people make that choice. In Kahneman's most recent book, which is excellent and everyone should read, he gives an example of one of their classic framing studies, which has come to be known as the Asian disease problem, and it goes like this. Pretend all of you in this room right now are public health professionals, like you work for the CDC or something. I have gathered you here today because there's a disease sweeping through Asia, and despite our best quarantine efforts, we expect it's going to make it to the US, and when it does, we expect that it's going to kill 600 people. We have two avenues for treatment, but we only have the resources to pursue one of them, and your job is to decide which one we pursue. Treatment option A is a sure thing. If we pick option A, 200 people will be saved of the 600. If we pick option B, there is a 1/3 chance that all 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 chance nobody will be saved. So which would you choose? Think about it for a sec. Save 200 people for sure, or the 1 in 3 gamble to save everyone? In their studies, they say a large majority chooses the sure thing. They choose to save 200 people. But a different group of people from the same background were given a slightly different choice. Faced with the same disease, they were also given two treatment options. If you choose option A, they were told 400 of the people will die for sure. If you choose option B, there's a 1/3 chance that nobody will die, but a 2/3 chance that all 600 people will die. Now, I can't give you the full sense of what it's like to hear this because I just told you the other group's choices, but what do you suppose this group would have chosen? To lose 400 people for sure, or to gamble to save everyone? In the study, large majority chose to gamble. If you're paying attention, you've already noticed those two groups were given the exact same choice. It was just a difference of framing. Save 200 and lose 400 describe the exact same outcome. But that choice of phrasing changed the way that people chose. And their conclusion was people will take a sure gain over a gamble, but they will take a gamble over a sure loss. But whether it's a sure gain or a sure loss is really just a question of how you describe it. That's the framing effect. But now comes the part that really blew my mind when I was reading this. Kahneman gathered the two groups together and explained, like I just did to you, the two different frames. He told them, you chose to save 200 lives in one formulation, and you chose to gamble rather than accept 400 deaths in the other. Now that you know these choices are inconsistent, how do you decide? And the answer, he says, is usually embarrassed silence. Why is it embarrassed silence? When people are given one frame or the other, they answer quickly. But when they're given both frames, they're paralyzed. Why? It turns out this is a really illuminating question. Here's the way I think a lot of people see framing. There's some core issue or decision to be made. And we have some feelings or moral intuitions about that issue. Frames are different ways of looking at the issue, and they can distort the issue and thereby distort our feelings for the core issue. If this is our model, and I think it's a really common one, I think that people generally approach it this way, then we would naturally regard framing with distrust. We see it as a way of manipulating us, of tricking us into making the wrong choices. But when you put it that way, if there's a wrong choice, it implies that we think that there is a right choice, and that right choice is the way we would decide if the problem were not framed at all. And that is why this model is wrong. There is no such thing as an unframed problem. You have to say it somehow. And in the Asian disease problem, the reason that final question is met with embarrassed silence is that once we're presented with both conflicting frames, we actually don't know how to decide. Gamble or certainty. When you frame it one way, we prefer one choice, but when you frame it the other way, we prefer the other choice. But then, when you give us both framings at once, we're paralyzed. We have no intuition. We have no right choice. Kahneman puts it this way. He says, framing should not be viewed as an intervention that masks or distorts an underlying preference. At least in this instance, there is no underlying preference that is masked or distorted by the frame. Like, no matter how many times I read that, that is still crazy to me. Think about that. We do not have underlying preferences. Kahneman continues, your moral feelings, he says, are attached to frames, to descriptions of reality, rather than to reality itself. Or to put it another way, with no frames, we do not have moral intuition. I walked you through this whole line of thinking to make a single point, and that is that framing itself is a deeply moral act. We tend to think of people who actively and consciously frame their conversations as manipulative, Machiavellian, even dishonest people. But in the Asian disease problem, let's say you're the person that has to write the email that's going to go to the experts that have to make the choice. It's very clear now that the way you choose to frame the choice in your email is the point at which the decision actually gets made. Because your email phrasing will determine which decision gets made. Let's go back to our friends Dale and Eugene. If you are ignorant of frames, if you don't take the time to carefully consider how you frame the choice, if you just pick whatever phrasing seems natural, you still framed it, and you are still responsible for the results of your actions. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Though I should be clear that when I say that framing is a moral act, I'm not saying that every frame itself is good. I just mean that when you decide how to frame something, that decision has moral implications, and thus the choice is a moral one. And so for Dale here, it's really a question of his intention. If his intention is good, then he is making a sound moral decision. Framing is a tool. If we wield it with both skill and wisdom, it can do great good. But if we are unskilled or unwise, it can cause great harm. So I spent some time thinking about when I was putting this talk together, like what can I actually talk about in regards to framing skill that would be helpful, right? Like what can I give you that you might actually be able to actually use in your daily work? I will quote Kahneman one more time. He says, "Unless there is an obvious reason to do otherwise, most of us passively accept decision problems as they are framed and therefore rarely have an opportunity to discover the extent to which our preferences are frame-bound rather than reality-bound." It takes attention and deliberate effort to hear something and to take a step back before you respond and say, how is that framed, and to analyze it and to consider its impact. But in my experience, once you are paying that attention, once you notice it happening around you, the rest of the skill, like how to respond and what to say, how to behave, will follow naturally. It's not easy, it takes a lot of work, but you'll be able to figure it out because you're now noticing the opportunities to do so. The initial sensitivity is the thing that really needs a jump start. It really needs your initial attention to get the ball rolling. So I thought it might be helpful, since I actually tend to think about this stuff kind of borderline compulsively. I collect archetypes of situations, of framing situations that I thought maybe I could describe. There are cases that I encounter frequently, and I think about them a lot, and I have them filed away mentally, and I find that it helps because one of these situations arises during the workday because I've kind of thought about it and categorized it away. In the moment that it happens, I'll notice. It's like I have kind of a spidey sense going off in the back of my head, and I'll think like, wait, this is one of those times. So the first situation I want to talk about is when you are collaborating, directly with someone else in a different team or department or organization. So I've drawn it out as this big formal org structure here, but the relevant thing is actually just that it's a cross-discipline kind of thing. That's a salient point. You are working with someone that you don't work with every single day, who's not on your immediate team, and these collaborations I find are usually prompted by a specific thing that you guys need to get done together. When I'm doing this, I start first by bringing to mind one model of game development, which is this. You can just think of game development as solving a set of constraints. My engineering is coming out. Your ship date is a constraint, right? Design goals are all constraints. Your target frame rate is a constraint. The process of shipping a game is just satisfying all of these constraints. Other constraints fall out from them, how many animations you need and what subsystems you have to code and all that good stuff. And in this model, every single team member's job is simply to own some set of those constraints and to ensure that they are satisfied. I like to bring this model to mind and kind of roll it around in my head to kind of get myself in this mindset when I'm working with people across team boundaries, because when we have some conflict, as inevitably happens with creative work, I can think of this model and remind myself, you're just trying to satisfy your constraints, I am just trying to satisfy my constraints. And when I'm able to stay in that mindset, I find that I naturally frame the situation as you and me versus the problem, which is collaborative, instead of getting stuck in you versus me, which is actually a really easy trap to fall into. Now, this frame is helpful, but just the simple intention is rarely enough because conflict still happens. People misinterpret and miscommunicate. We do things trying to help, but our actions come across the wrong way. And though rationally we all know we're working towards the same goals, it's very easy in practice to lose sight of that. Sometimes the waters get rough, and navigating them takes a little bit more nuance. So for that nuance, I'm going to turn to another researcher. Deborah Tannen is a professor of linguistics and an expert on human communication, has written a bunch of books. And in her book on family relationships, she has a model for understanding conflict that I really like and actually think is super applicable to professional relationships too. You can see your relationship, she says, existing somewhere in this two-dimensional space. One axis is a continuum from closeness to distance, and the other one is a continuum from equality to hierarchy. Now, when you and we have some relationship, it exists in both of our heads. Don't worry about drawing. This is going to be on like a million slides, so everyone who's writing down, you can... When you and I have a relationship, it exists in both of our heads. So we each have some idea of where we are in this space, and it can be more or less aligned. maybe you think that we're closer than I do, or maybe I think that we're peers, and maybe you disagree. So what I'm showing here right now is kind of an extreme case, especially at work, because in my experience, I think most working relationships, by default, most of the time, are pretty well aligned. We usually have a pretty good mutual understanding of where we are with respect to one another. Here's the important thing. Your view of where we are on this chart, whether you are conscious of it or not, is a frame that you bring to all of our interactions. You behave differently towards me depending on where you think we are in this space. And of course, for me, it's the same. My behavior towards you is framed by my view. And then you can steer us around on this chart by behaving in certain ways, so it's a feedback loop. Where we think we are on the chart affects our behavior, and then our behavior affects where we think we are on the chart. Arguments often result, Tannen says, when you feel yourself or someone else moving around the grid in ways that make you uncomfortable. Too much closeness and too much hierarchy, for example, or too much equality and too much distance. In cross-team collaborations, then, I want us always to be at the bottom of this chart. I am always shooting for equality. That's part of my frame. We both have our constraints. We're both trying to solve them. Both of our constraints are important, and we're interacting as peers. I use a tone I would use when talking to a peer. I spend time listening to the other person and understanding her concerns, but I regard them as equal to my own. I try not to be dismissive, but I also try not to be deferential. I deliberately behave in a way that communicates we are equals. As for whether I aim to the left or the right, that's more of a case-by-case thing. It depends on how close I think we are. If she and I are friendly, I'll lean on that a little bit. Our rapport means I can assume a bit more, not have to spend as much time reassuring her of my motives. If she and I don't know each other as well, I'll incorporate a little more distance into the way I frame things just as kind of a matter of common respect. Given this, when we conflict, that means that she disagrees with what I am communicating about where we are in this chart, which means that one of a few things has happened. Perhaps I have misread where we are on that horizontal axis, the closeness to distance spectrum. If I'm treating her as closer than she feels we are, I can come off as invasive. I can come off as overly patronizing, where to her it feels like I'm trying to pretend we're closer than we are in the hopes that she'll go along with things like a used car salesman, kind of pretending you're kind of chummy. And she will likely react by pushing in the other direction, being distant, being cold, clamming up. If, on the other hand, I am the one being too distant, and she feels that we're closer than that, she can end up feeling abandoned or left out, or she can infer that I'm deliberately being cold or callous because I expect that we're going to fight and I'm preparing for conflict. So those are the errors of closeness and distance. And the good news there is those signs are pretty easy to spot as long as you're looking for them. And then the other way that things can go wrong is the vertical axis. I can simply fail to communicate equality, and something about my behavior can convey an unintended frame of hierarchy. And Tannen says, at the hierarchy end, every relationship is a power struggle. Someone is one up, and someone is one down. When cross-team collaborations end up stuck in conflict at the hierarchy end of things, I think it's almost always because someone feels that one of their constraints, something that they're responsible for, is not being respected. And that is an assertion of control by the other person, which is a quality of hierarchical relationships and not equal relationships. The important thing here to internalize is that every time your constraints are disregarded, it makes your job harder. If I tell you I can't build you a tool because someone else's needs have priority, that means now you have to work harder to get your job done. And that is why these kinds of conflicts can be so emotionally charged. If what you're hearing is that I don't respect your constraints, then you're also hearing me say I don't value your time, and by extension, I don't value you. So, in cross-team relationships, the challenge is to bring the right frames to your work together so both of you understand your relationship to be in the same place on this chart. You want it all the way down at equality and in the appropriate spot between distance and closeness. When there's misalignment, when you are either miscommunicating or actually disagreeing about your location on this chart, it damages your interaction. And then that damages the result of your work together. And the severity of that damage gets worse the more misaligned you are. And it gets worse the longer you allow that misalignment to continue. You know, a couple awkward minutes in a meeting is one thing, but if you don't resolve it, you let it stew overnight, that can really damage the relationship more and more and impair your ability to do great work together. That is why it's crucial that you do two things. First, do your best to read the situation clearly in the first place so you know where on this chart to aim. And then second, always be reading the other person as you're going, watching for that feedback and responding to it with no delay. It can be kind of a delicate dance sometimes, and it definitely takes a lot of practice. And that's why it's important to have a really good model in your head for it and then pay it the attention that it deserves. All right, situation number 2. I began this talk by describing a situation where I was giving someone advice to be patronizing on purpose over email, and maybe you're wondering what that was about. So let me go back and fill in the blanks. Situation number 1 was about relationships between equals, but obviously not all team relationships are between equals. Again, I've drawn this out as a kind of formal org chart, but whether you have a very formal, rigid org chart or no org chart at all, it remains the case that some relationships are more hierarchical than others. Hierarchy reinforces perception. If we hire someone as junior, I will perceive him to be junior to begin with, and I'll interact with him as I would a junior employee, and unless something really happens to change my perception, it's going to tend to stay there. Perception reinforces hierarchy. Because I see him as junior, I'm not going to go to him with the kinds of questions I would ask someone senior. I'm not readily going to trust him with the kinds of responsibilities I'd trust to someone senior. So because I see him as junior, I'm less likely to give him the opportunity to do more senior work. On the other hand, someone who is already senior, who I perceive to be senior, has to really screw up to push my perception very far down, right? I think the reality is, as humans, we're very susceptible to confirmation bias, which is where we pick the evidence that confirms the conclusion we want to draw. And so our perceptions of people are stable. You know, this loop here represents cognitive bias, and cognitive bias causes us to pigeonhole people where they are. A good example of this, a number of years ago, a friend of mine got his PhD at UT Austin, and then he started looking at other universities to go to for his postdoctoral work. And I was like, wait a minute, you love Austin. Why don't you stay here and do your postdoctoral work? And he laughed, and he was like, everybody knows you don't do your postdoctoral work at the same university you get your doctorate from because they knew you when you were a grad student, and they will always see you as a grad student. The unsavory reality of cognitive bias means that if you're trying to put it in these terms, if you're trying to get a promotion, you have to be doing better work than the people who are already at that level because they have inertia keeping them there, and you have inertia keeping you down. A clarification before I go further with this example. You may be listening to this and being like, I don't know what he's talking about. I'm not trying to get a promotion. I'm using you in a casual sense. Take this example however it's relevant. Maybe it's pertinent to someone on a team that you manage. Maybe it's pertinent to a colleague that you're friendly with. In any case, obviously, to be more senior, you need to actually do more senior work. You need to step up, you need to take more initiative, you need to contribute more value to your team and your company. I'm not suggesting that you should be deceiving people into believing you are doing better work than you are. On the other hand, sometimes there's this idea that it should just be enough to do the better work and everyone should just notice and that should be fine. And humans don't work that way. That's kind of a naive way to approach it. There are a set of people that you work with who do know exactly what you do. You know, they're close to you, they're reviewing everything you do, they sit next to you, they talk to you all the time. These people won't need any convincing when you're doing more senior work. They're already going to know about it. But right now, as you and I sit here in this room together, there is someone influential on your team who is more senior than you, who has basically no idea what you do. And that person has a perception of you, and it's probably outdated. And if you've been kicking ass and hoping for recognition, that person is going to cause you difficulty. If humans were completely rational, that person would recognize that he knows nothing about what you do, and in conversations about you, that person would say, hey, I don't have any factual evidence to back this up, so I'm going to sit this one out. That is not how humans work. In fact, if you read the news, you may know sometimes having less factual evidence makes our opinions stronger. that person's perception of you is compelling to him, right? He can't help but feel it viscerally. That's just how humans work. And so if someone suggests, hey, we're going to give this person a promotion, that person can't just sit back and be like, okay, that's cool, you know better than me. At the very least, even if that person's being responsible, he's probably going to say, okay, well, convince me at least. And convincing him is going to take time, it's going to take effort, putting together proof, talking through it, going back and forth, documenting it. That's bureaucracy, which is overhead, which is inertia, which is holding you back. You can complain about how unfair this is, but the truth is, it is your fault this person sees you this way because you teach people how to treat you. His perception of you is largely based on the way you frame your interactions with him. To change his perception, you have to change the framing. Remember that earlier quote. Unless there is an obvious reason to do otherwise, most of us passively accept the frames that we are given. Those frames aren't going to change themselves. When he talks to you, he's going to frame it as, I'm more senior than you, not because he's a jerk, but because that's how he sees things. That's his view of the world. And unless you're really paying attention, you will use his frame when you respond without even realizing it. For example, he might write to you and say, sounds like things in your area are running behind a bit. I need you to send me the current schedule so I can figure out how it impacts my team. I just made this up. This is not actually a real quote. But it seems pretty reasonable, right? It's not like he wrote to you and was like, get me a coffee. But let's take a minute and analyze the frame of the message. So look at the first sentence. Sounds like things in your area are running behind a bit. He could have phrased this as a question, like, hey, someone said your schedule's changed. I just wanted to ask you what was up. But he didn't. He said it as a statement. He told you how your work is, which is talking down. And then there's the second sentence. I need you to send me the current schedule so I can figure out how it impacts my team. Again, there's a power dynamic there, right? He could have qualified it. He could have said, hey, when you have time, or hey, sorry for the short notice. He didn't do that. And he could have phrased it as a question. He could have said, could you send me your schedule? Or he could have shown deference by being oblique, like, hey, it would really help me out if I had your schedule. And he didn't do any of that. The only way he could have been more hierarchical about it would have been to actually issue it as a direct order, but he came pretty close. If you reply to this email and you do not actively change the frame in your response, you are confirming his frame. Even if you just write back and say, like, sure, okay, sounds good, I'll send that to you. You're implicitly telling him, this is the right way to treat me. This is the right way to see me. Right? The way that you view our relationship is correct because I didn't bother to try to challenge it. So at this point, you have to stop and think about what you want the power dynamic to actually be. So take Tannen's vertical axis here. Let's say you want to relate to this guy as a peer. So you want to push down towards equality. Okay, frame it that way. I find this part actually takes a certain amount of active visualization. So you kind of come up with the frame in your head. So in this case, let's say it's you and I are peers. You have to roll it around in your head until you start to believe it. You have to really kind of try it on and see how it fits. And it's very important because if you've just been going with the flow for a while, like it or not, you have his frame stuck in your head. You have to convince yourself before you have any hope of convincing anyone else. And so that is where I would give advice, like, don't be deferential here. In fact, turn the tables by being a little bit patronizing. He's talking down to you, talk down to him. Write back and say, oh, that's funny. I was about to write and ask you for the same thing. Anyway, I'd be glad to make some time to help you understand things a bit better. Let's grab coffee this afternoon. Do you see, I think it's subtle, but hopefully you see how, where that's a little bit patronizing. But it's not about being mean, right, or like out-alphaing someone. It can be playful, right? You can be kind of teasing about it. Like, it's not aggression, it's kind of a sly wink to it. This is the way that a peer would talk to him. There's that old saying of dress for the job you want and not the job you have. It's kind of like speak from the position that you want, not the position you've been boxed into. The only qualification that I would give to this is that people will reject frames if they are wildly different from their own. Like if your CEO sends an email to the whole company and you write back privately to him like you guys are like pals, you're probably going to get fired. But slight adjustments over time will work. It takes effort because you have to step back every single time and analyze and respond thoughtfully and get yourself out of the habit of just playing into somebody else's frame. But you have to do it because it's your responsibility to teach other people how they should treat you. Don't sit by passively and let people frame you into a little box. Take charge. All right, that was peer relationships and hierarchical relationships. I would like to talk about one more of these archetypes this afternoon, and I think it's especially an important one for those of us who manage people. So it is cliche, and I think rather obvious for companies to say, we think that people are the most valuable asset we have. And companies have ways that they can show that. They can invest in perks, they can invest in management training, they can treat their people well. They have a lot of ways to show that they care. As a leader, as a manager, as a human being, as a person, what do you do to show that you care? And this is where I think the subtlety lies. Many managers and leaders that I see claim to care about their employees, but actually end up using a frame like, I care about your work result, or I care about making you happy so you don't quit, right? There is a different frame, and that is, I care about you. When I talk to people about this, sometimes they'll argue, they'll say, well, those are really the same thing, right? Because happy people do good work, so it's just good business sense, and they're all really interconnected. I agree that these things are inseparable, but I don't agree that they're the same thing. They're different things, and that's important because if you want to be genuine, what I have found is that they cannot overlap. What do I mean by that? When you're having a conversation, if your frame is, I care about your work results, that means it is not, I care about you. They are mutually exclusive frames. If the person you're talking to has the sense that your first priority in this conversation is her work result, she knows that she is not your first priority right now. Let's say the two of you are having some meeting, you're trying to suss out some design problem. It takes some pretty rough compromises from both of you. Things are pretty tight, but after a while you work on it, you come up with a plan that you think is pretty solid. You can tell she knows you've both done the right things, but she's really frustrated and disappointed about the compromises that she's had to make. And let's say, because you are an empathetic and decent human being, you can feel her frustration and disappointment and you wish that you could help. What I'm saying is because you've just spent a whole meeting framed in terms of the work product, it's challenging to immediately shift over to saying, I care about you. It's easy for your words to ring hollow if she feels like you're still focused on the work results. And then even if what you're saying is, I want to express my genuine compassion, she may just hear you making some kind of vulgar gesture or faking concern, or it may come across as like, hey, I really hope that your frustration does not interfere with your work. So from that, I would say expressing personal caring for people at work is best done, in my experience, by carving out a separate space for it. So I myself spend a lot of time at Top Pot Donuts, which is a 2-block walk from my office. And I get weird looks from the employees sometimes when it's like my third visit of the day. But I do not go there for the donuts. I resist the donuts. I go there one-on-one with colleagues because it gives us some distance, some physical distance from work, and thereby makes it easier to frame our conversation as a personal one. In the example I just gave with a frustrated colleague, I'd probably let the meeting end, give it a couple hours, and then send a quick email saying, like, look, that meeting was pretty rough. I feel kind of bad about it. I think we did the right thing, but you want to grab some coffee and chat about it. And while I keep mentioning coffee, obviously the coffee is not the point. The important thing is that you carve out protected space during your workday where you can interact with people where the frame is, I care about you. Be a good listener, express your concern, learn about them, do all the things humans do when they're building relationships. And that goes for all of your colleagues, and if you're a manager, I think it goes double for your reports. This is why one-on-one meetings with your reports, if you're a manager, are so important. But it's also why it's so important not to let them just turn into status meetings, right? Because if you let your one-on-ones become status meetings, what you're communicating is, this space is about the work result, right? This space is not about you. It gets a little bit tricky because sometimes status updates can actually be a good way to jumpstart a one-on-one if you don't really have anything to talk about. But you should be viewing the status update as a kind of entry into kind of the more human space and always pushing for that. Sometimes it is as easy as just starting with, how are you? But then sometimes you'll do that, and what you'll actually get is a status update, like, oh, I'm fine, I'm ahead of schedule on this thing, I'm worried about this other thing, and I was talking to this guy about how we're going to do this other thing, and that's totally fine. You can be a good listener, you can sit through that, you can absorb it, and then when the person is done talking, you just smile and say, that sounds great. How are you? In my experience, from cases I've seen, from managers I've had and those I've worked with, this is one of the big things that separates passable managers from ones where I felt like they were really great. I think it's really tempting as a manager, and especially a new manager, to keep your interactions with your reports entirely in kind of a work frame, and to defend it as like, well, my job isn't to like be their best friend. My job is just to, get the best results out of them that we can. But if you keep all of your conversations to these work-related frames, you'll never really get to know them as people. And I don't know how you can possibly expect to manage someone well if you don't really know him. I think at some level the obvious reason why people don't employ this frame more often, or it's so easy to kind of conveniently avoid it and slip into those other kind of near enemy frames, is that caring about people is scary because it's intimate and it means being vulnerable. But strong working relationships are personal relationships, right? And personal relationships do involve caring for one another. So you have to carve out that time and make it a habit. All right, well, those were the three archetypes I wanted to talk about. Hopefully some of those scenarios were interesting or thought-provoking or gave you some new way to see a familiar situation. Like I said in the beginning, I think so much of this work is just starting to develop that sensitivity, the kind of like spidey sense to know what to look for. So when you find yourself sitting in a meeting or, in a conversation, suddenly the thought will kind of pop up like, hey, this is one of those times. And when you have that thought pop up, it's great because it gives you an opportunity. You have the ability to suddenly make a conscious choice about how you respond. Towards the beginning of this talk, I said framing is a tool, and it takes two things. It takes skill and it takes wisdom. So I just spent the last 40 minutes talking about the skill. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the wisdom side of things. Because it's one thing to analyze this stuff technically, but I find that viscerally people still respond to it negatively. Like maybe you were listening and in your head you were thinking like, oh my God, like this guy overanalyzes like crazy. If you did, you should know you're not the first person to levy that accusation against me. And there's still that question of Dale and Eugene. I kind of like spent some time up front trying to convince you, hey, there are a bunch of Dales out there who are using this knowledge nobly, who are trying to do good with it. But I think all of us really know a number of people who are like that who don't. And I think that's reflected in the basic vocabulary we have in the English language when we talk about this stuff. Is stuff like manipulative or scheming or calculated. We want to believe that it's enough just to have good intentions, that this kind of analysis is unnecessary, is overthinking, and in doing so, we implicitly assume that those who do this must be malicious, must have some kind of ulterior motive. I believe that the opposite is true. I believe that this practice is a noble one. I believe that it is not just okay. I believe that it is vital, and that doing it deeply enriches our lives. This is the wood shop that I grew up with as a kid. Both of my parents are skilled woodworkers, and it was my mother's profession for a long time. So I had this shop in my basement when I was growing up. As soon as they thought I was old enough, my parents taught me how to use all the tools safely, what precautions to take, how they worked, what they did. My mother's work was folk art, which was a business that left her plenty of free time to spend with us kids for a good part of the year. The price was that in the months approaching Christmas, she was basically living down there and working every waking moment. During those busy times, she'd pay us to help. Most of her work was with standard 3/4-inch thick pine stock, and it always needed sanding. And I was a precocious negotiator, so I talked her up to like a nickel or maybe even a dime a piece to sand her work front, back, and any of the flat edges on that belt sander that you can see to the left of the photo. When the work was there, I could make like $10 an hour sanding that stuff, which at that age was a ton of money. I got so good with it. I was super fast at it. And I learned every detail. I learned every nuance of that belt sander. Sometimes the belt starts to slide off one side or the other. You have to adjust the front roller just right to keep it centered. And when you're using it, the belt will fill up with wood dust. And there's this stick of dense black gum, like the world's largest pencil eraser, that you press against the belt. You kind of watch it strips off the caked up pine dust and reveals the deep red sanding belt underneath. I started with the belt sander because it was one of the safer tools, but in time I learned them all. We had a shopsmith, which is, you can see at the left. It's a big motor. It slides along these metal rails, and they make all these attachments for it. Bandsaw, lathe, drill press, jigsaw. Basically, any wood tool you can imagine you can get as a shopsmith attachment. And they last forever, which is why the company is now out of business. So I learned them one by one. I'd draw little snaking lines on wood with pencil and practice tracing them on the bandsaw. Or I'd learn how to hold a chisel against a wood blank when it was turning in the lathe, learning the right motor speed for each tool, learning how to care for them, how to fix them when they broke. And along the way, I learned to really respect the tools and their power. I still remember the sound the bandsaw made when you turned it on. You flip the switch on the motor, it's this really loud metal clack, and then this kind of whining, pitching noise as the saw blade spins up. No matter how many times I used it, at that noise, I always felt the slightest twinge of fear when it started. But it was good because it kept me alert and made sure I was paying attention. Along the way, I also learned great respect and even love for the wood itself. Just 6 months ago, I made these tables out of black walnut in my backyard in Seattle. I spent probably 100 or 200 hours surfacing and finishing the wood, and almost all of that time was between me and a simple block plane or hand sander in the wood. I made a few initial cuts with a table saw, but other than that, I did everything with hand tools. I got to know every subtle curve in the surface of each table. Each plank was different with a unique beauty in the grain and edge. And I look back on those hours as a collaboration between the wood and me, working together to bring out the potential in that grain and to make something beautiful. It takes craft to make art. It takes skill with any medium and any tool set to make something beautiful. And communication is a craft just like any other in every way, except for one. In craft and in art, we are accustomed to being the craftspeople and the artists. But in human relationships, we are also the medium. We shape each other. We work on each other. We can help to smooth off each other's rough edges, and with great skill and enough care, we can refine one another. We can help to bring out the beauty and potential that exists within each of us. But through misuse, we can and we all do harm one another. And so when we meet someone who uses these tools consciously, our reaction is suspicion, is apprehension. And this is as it should be. Fear is a normal reaction to a situation that could cause us harm. The fear is not the problem. The problem is when we let that fear stop us. The proper response to fear is gratitude, is appreciation. Appreciation that it's there to warn you about danger. Appreciation that it's keeping you alert. And then after that, the proper response is to continue to act just with extraordinary care. A life lived in the shadow of fear is one where we misunderstand what the fear is telling us. With communication, we misunderstand when we think the fear is telling us that the tools themselves are evil or the people who use them are villainous. It is not. It is simply letting us know that we need to be careful. The skill of communication and the knowledge that comes from analyzing human interactions, these things are tools that we can use to do great things. If we let our fear dissuade us from using them at all, we forfeit the chance to do that good. Okay, you ask, but what about those people we all know who do use these tools to do harm, who use them for their own personal material gain at the expense of others? I think it's easy to feel anger and contempt for these people, and when we have to work directly with them, we can feel threatened, we can feel upset. But perhaps we should instead feel compassion. When we learn a craft, every moment of that learning is an opportunity to open our eyes to great beauty. When I was a child and I didn't know anything about woodworking, I'd look at a piece of furniture, all I would see was the utility. This one's for holding books. That one's for holding clothes. Practicing woodworking opened my eyes. Now I look at furniture and I see the utility, but also the care and the craftsmanship, the beauty of the wood itself, and even like a little camaraderie for the person who made it, knowing, oh, this section must have been really difficult, or being able to admire the quality of a specific joint. That appreciation, that ability to encounter something and see not just the outer surface of the thing, but also the time and care and love that it's made of, that is our sensitivity to all of the beauty and joy and love in the world. There is one catch. Our practice will teach us nothing unless we bring our attention to those moments. We have to be willing to see. We have to let the experience change us. If we practice carelessly, then our eyes remain closed. And so while it's frustrating to see a skilled communicator who uses his words to harm or climb ladders to earn a bonus at someone else's expense, when my mind is open, I look at a person like that and it breaks my heart. To have such skill with words, he must have practiced for so long. And the whole time, he had such opportunity to see the beauty in other people, to see the beauty in himself, and the joy in relationships, but he didn't. You can't explain those things to someone who doesn't see them. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind from birth. And so he doesn't even know what he's missing. He thinks the goal is acquisition. Tries to fill his life with material wealth because that's all he knows. If you find yourself working with someone like this, I might humbly suggest a little meditation to develop compassion for him, and it goes like this. When we do not know happiness, and we try to fill its void with pleasure, we suffer. Okay, so if communication and the study of human interaction is a craft that opens our eyes, what exactly does it open our eyes to? Well, just like woodworking taught me deeply the nature of wood, communication deeply teaches us the true nature of people. And the more we know something, the more genuinely we're able to love it. At the end of the day, I think some of our aversion to this analysis is subconsciously part of us doesn't want to see our true nature. We don't like the idea that we can be manipulated, that someone else can trick us with the simple wording of a question. We want to believe that our preferences are rational and well considered, and that our behavior is governed by reason. But these things are not true. And believing them does us no more good than it would a woodworker to pretend that wood does not burn or cannot be broken. We are creatures, you and I, and these are our vulnerabilities. We are afraid of vulnerability, but it is the truth of our nature, and only by acknowledging it can we truly love one another. The more we practice, the more we start to see just how much of our interaction with each other every day are these ways of staying safe. You know, they're nothing but boilerplate, habit, neurosis, polite strategies for saying the right things but keeping our distance. We greet one another and we converse. But if we aren't really present, it's like our words are just kind of read off a script. The power of this work is that seeing gives us a choice. We can choose not to give the boilerplate response. We can choose to respond with sincerity. We can choose connection. And that's why I believe so strongly in the value of this work. I hope something I've said this afternoon has been helpful to you. Thank you very much for coming.